Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. A BBC documentary titled How to Die, Simon's Choice has racked up millions of views, sparking a heated debate both in the UK and in China regarding the controversial practice of assisted suicide. Only a few countries in the world have legalized euthanasia or assisted suicide, with religious interests often leading the fight against the practice. What are the moral and ethical arguments for and against assisted suicide? And what are the responsibilities of both the government and medical professionals in such circumstances? In China, 70% of those polled take a more pragmatic approach to the practice. What is the likelihood of its legalization in this country? Joining us in the Beijing studio here today are David Rothstein, Vice President for Medical Affairs at the United Family Healthcare, and Gregory Yingnian Zhang, former President of the Seattle chapter of the National Association of Chinese Americans. But first, let's take a look at this background report.
The BBC documentary How to Die, Simon's Choice told the story of a successful businessman, Simon Binner, who was diagnosed with a motor neuron disease and given 2 years to live. The disease caused Simon to lose the use of his voice within weeks of the diagnosis. Faced with the prospect of a rapid physical decline, Simon decided to end his life at a Swiss suicide clinic. At first, his family thought it was just Simon's impulsive emotion, but they were persuaded by his persistence. Simon said he was not afraid to die and expressed his deep love of his wife and family at the end of his life. Euthanasia, or assisted suicide, is not legal in the UK. In a recent vote, 118 members of Parliament were in favour of the Assisted Dying Bill, with 330 MPs against it. In 2002, the Netherlands became the first country to allow euthanasia. Euthanasia is now also legal in Belgium, Luxembourg and Colombia. Assisted suicide is legal in Switzerland, Germany, Albania, Japan and several states in the US. Euthanasia deaths in the Netherlands have increased from 1,923 cases in 2006 to 6,000 cases in 2014. Also, the standard for acceptable euthanasia has expanded from people suffering incurable disease to people with mental illness. Some experts are worried euthanasia in the Netherlands will get out of control. How to prevent potential abuse of euthanasia criteria remains a question in any country.
To me, as human beings, it's so important that when people are in distress, we come alongside them, we help them. We don't say, oh, you don't think your life is worth living anymore? We'll help you die. Even though people think they're getting another choice, what they're actually doing is giving another person power to kill them, power to cause their death.
A survey conducted in China in 2013 showed more than 2/3 of Chinese have an open and tolerant attitude toward euthanasia. However, both euthanasia and assisted suicide continue to be illegal in China. They are regarded as a removal of the right to life, which is against the Constitution.
Gentlemen, are you for or against assisted suicide? David?
I'm clearly against it.
Why?
Well, the first reason is people have been killing themselves for millennia without the assistance of doctors. I really don't think, as a physician, that doctors need to be involved in this process at all. Furthermore, I don't think physicians should be put in the position of carrying out policies that clearly have wider social implications for governments, for societies, religious overtones. Physicians are not the right people to be put in the middle of this.
To a large degree, you represent the perspective and position of medical professionals whose job, of course, is to assist with the patient to keep them alive as long as possible. But what's your position?
I would say under certain circumstances, I think this practice is essential for the following reasons. Number one, if the patient himself or herself has decided enough is enough, I think he or she is entitled to make a decision about his future, about his life, live or die, number one. Second, if the case is a terminal case with a lot of pain surrounding the patient, so to live one day means to suffer one day. Under the circumstances, I think if he make a decision like that, that request should be honored. Thirdly, I believe that there are many other loved ones surrounding this patient. To see this person without any hope for recovery and to keep on going suffering is not a good outcome, not a good situation to face up to. So they may see this as a necessary choice, lesser of the two evil. Another possibility is this, that the medical expenses, the facilities, the resources available, if used in a different area, could be served for different purposes. But last of all, I don't think physicians would enjoy seeing a patient, this status, every day, day in, day out, without any hope. And just because I'm a doctor, I cannot take one's life away. But in this case, there should be a second consideration to consider other possibilities.
You know, David, when people listen to what you say on your decision and your position, they have a strong mixed feeling immediately for the following reason. First of all, you are humanitarian enough. You, as a medical professional, your job is, of course, to protect the life and the dignity. The opposite view might be you are a little bit selfish to protect your face and the face of the profession itself, regardless of the pains and suffering of both the families and the terminally ill patient. What do you make of the mixed response?
Mixed response is not unexpected. I can explain every one of those points, however. As a physician, I don't view the patient as my sole responsibility. I view the patient as part of my responsibility, including the family. So when I consider caring for a terminally ill person, I'm devoted to relieving their suffering, and thankfully modern medicine can relieve the suffering of any patient now. I can guarantee no patient will suffer pain as they pass from this world. So in the olden days, when we didn't have the technology to relieve suffering while keeping a patient alive, you might have made a stronger argument for doing this. But now we can relieve the suffering. Secondly, the suffering of the patient is not the only consideration. It's also the suffering of the family. And the family often feels abandoned by patients who do this. Even in this documentary, when they interviewed the wife afterwards, she felt angry, she felt guilty, she felt abandoned by her husband. Throughout the entire process, none of the family members wanted him to do this. So that has to be taken into consideration too. The physician has the responsibility for the well-being of the patient and the family. Thirdly, financial considerations come into play here. This patient paid £7,000 to have assisted suicide. Time and time again, we see physicians making clinical decisions based on money as the motive. I worry that by paying physicians a lot of money to do something relatively simple, we may be incentivizing this activity negatively. We may be causing more harm than good. And so there are many, many considerations that go into this. My opposition to this has nothing to do with protecting the face of the medical profession. I said from the beginning that I don't think I don't think the medical profession is well equipped, trained, ethically sound enough to be in the middle of this.
Let me take on one of the things you said. Family members of the terminally ill patient might feel that they are abandoned by their loved one. However, what do you think of the quote-unquote wishful thinking of the patient whose days are numbered? They feel that they could be abandoned if their wishes were not to be given due considerations, namely to respect their will, to die peacefully and to have a dignified death. What do you think of this opposite feeling, that the patient might feel that he or she could feel abandoned if they are given a cold shoulder?
I certainly believe if the patient, before this disease strikes heavily, for him to lose his action or motion capability, like for example, in the United States, you have this advanced directives to tell what you wish to be done to yourself in case you become in such a helpless situation and there's no chance for recovery. So I like to see that practice being publicized and be available to all patients when they get into the hospitals, and ahead of time, even if your condition is still good enough to survive, but you should anticipate the unexpected happen in the future. So when that is the case, I do believe the hospitals, the physicians should honor the request of the person, use at least a passive approach. That is to discontinue, for example, life-sustaining appendices, or not supply the oxygen or certain drugs, or feed the tubes through the stomach. So if that practice exists, I do think passive euthanasia is a good practice myself.
I actually agree with this, and this is the nuance. There's a difference between withholding heroic measures, withholding life-supportive measures at the direction of patients and family, versus actively killing somebody. I know it often gets confused, but euthanasia is not failure to resuscitate. Euthanasia is taking an active approach to terminate the life. Advanced directives, which I agree with, give the medical professionals guidance as to what should be withheld should I be in a terminal state, unable to express my wishes. That's a very significant difference.
In the Netherlands, Colombia, and other countries, just a few of them, euthanasia is legalized.
Right.
It means a majority of those who vote for euthanasia through a referendum may have brushed aside your considerations as a physician, and therefore there must be some legitimacy for their support of the euthanasia. What do you think of their mindset? Is that a religious factor or the other way around?
Two things come to mind when you raise that issue. Let's take the Netherlands. Interesting, the Netherlands has until recently had no palliative care developed in that society. Palliation is providing hospice care, providing support, providing compassionate pain relief to a patient that is terminal, and allowing the natural course to take place, allowing the patient to die with dignity over time, with the family making an adjustment. That's different from euthanasia. And the reason why the Netherlands had no palliative care was because the physicians basically said, we don't need palliative care because we have euthanasia, right? So they have been denied the benefits of palliative care, which for the most part, aside from relieving the suffering of a dying patient, it allows families to make this adjustment. So when the patient is gone, the families don't feel remorse, they don't feel guilty, they don't feel angry. They've been able to adjust. This is why I say the responsibility of a doctor is beyond just the patient. It includes their family. Second point is, just because a society votes one way to enact a law doesn't mean the law is right. We have had many instances in the world's history where entire countries view people of another country or of another race to be subhuman. Does that make those countries correct because everyone in the country believes that way? So clearly, what gets passed in a law doesn't always mean that it's correct.
That makes a good point. However, financially, when someone who knows his or her days are numbered in the hospital and the critical condition believes that it's utterly a waste of money to use whatever pain relief methods to prolong the life, that would come to no avail. That would be a waste of financial resources, either for the family or for the government, whose public spending accounts for much of that and covers this, of course, through medical insurance. That would be, beyond this is eventually a matter of a sense and sensibility, right? In terms of sense, it means a huge waste of money. So for the issue of sensibility, it's about how to look at the feelings of the families and the friends and the colleagues. So what do you think of the contradiction here?
Well, in terms of medical expenses, of course, it is a factor involving whether or not to terminate the life of a patient, to save or not to save money. But it's more complicated than that. For example, if a person is covered by medical insurances, this happens in many countries, United States, Taiwan, region, and so on. So to the patient himself, herself, or the family members of the patient, it's not a concern because it's covered. Secondly, sometimes an insurance program would not cover the whole expense. Therefore, the portion has to be paid by the members of the patient. Is quite a bit of financial burden. So that may come into play. But nevertheless, I do believe individual cases have to look at individually. For example, if there's a medical coverage, if the hospital can conduct the proper care to prolong the life of the person, if the members of the patient agree that to continue, that should continue. On the other hand, if there are different opinions, other considerations, the resources is limited. If you have this medical facilities or doctor's care applied to other patients would serve a different purpose, or the financial burden to the families too hectic. So when that comes into play, there should be a different consideration. So I do not believe there should be a one approach, say, black and white. It's looking to each case individually to decide what to do or not to do.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with David Rothstein and Gregory Yin-Zhang. We are discussing the recent release of a BBC documentary called How to Die, Simon's Choice, and its wider implications. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. Here is a very sensational and controversial point. Opponents of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide contend that doctors have a moral responsibility to keep their patients alive, as reflected by the Hippocratic Oath. And they argue that there may be a slippery slope from euthanasia to murder, and that legalizing euthanasia will unfairly target the poor and disabled and create incentives for insurance companies to terminate lives in order to save money. What do you make of this case?
I agree with the statement you just said, that it is a slippery slope. And if we start with the Hippocratic Oath, which physicians the world over swear an allegiance to upon receiving their medical degree, the Hippocratic Oath basically sets a standard that says, I'm paraphrasing, that first we will do no harm. Interestingly, the Hippocratic Oath becomes very specific, and it said, if I am ever asked to supply poison to a patient, or to someone to use on another patient, I will never do that, right? So what's actually happening now, the physicians who are using medicines to kill people are violating an oath they swore to. This is I find this
Excuse me, this is a very sensational use of a word to kill people. I mean, this is a little bit too much for us to characterize the way that Simon's life was put to an end. What do you think of the use of killing?
Well, the other word is mercy killing.
Oh, mercy killing.
Yeah,
well, that sounds more acceptable
mercy killing,
for the audience.
I would say, as a physician, of course, I'm not one, not only try to prolong the life of a patient at all times, doing everything possible, but perhaps even more important, I think, is to keep him healthy and happy. In this case, if a terminal case of patient is beyond the possibility of reversal his situation, and he's suffering every day because of cancer or other things, I think doctors should take that into consideration just as much as thinking about keep it going further alive. So I go back to my point again. I think passive actions taken to discontinue or not to start life-sustaining devices is important.
Now, let me give you one example to illustrate the extreme case where it's very difficult to make your decision in a split second. For example, in a war zone, in the battlefield, you guys were encircled by the enemy whose job is to capture and to kill you. You are also their enemy. Now, with one helicopter of the rescue team descending on the battlefield, one of your comrades, one of the soldiers was critically wounded, and he suffers the pains, and he says, "Please give me a bullet in the head, and I don't think I'll survive the next few minutes." Now, is this your top concern at this moment, to save him and put him on board the helicopter, which is a mission impossible because a helicopter is a few hundred meters away, or you just kill him, a mercy killing, and to help end his life without having the enemy capture your soldier, your comrade, because that would mean months of torture or even more brutal killing of your soldier. Would you agree to exercise the mercy killing? Because he's painful. He's going through the last minutes of his life, and you refuse to kill him simply because you have the Hippocratic oath.
So does it need to be a physician who fires a bullet into someone's head? You don't need medical training to do that, right? And so
you mean you agree to kill him?
I don't agree. I don't agree to kill anybody, but so what we're talking about is not a battlefield scenario. We're talking about the assisted suicide to patients who consider themselves to be suffering too much. Now, the reason why, another reason why I disagree with this is because there are some patients who feel they're suffering too much who don't have a terminal illness. What if you were depressed? And most people who kill themselves are depressed. They don't have a terminal illness if it's treated, but they think it's terminal, so they kill themselves. Well, if we operate on every patient who thinks they're terminal and just says, well, you want to kill yourself, well, I'll help you.
Of course, we should not be at the mercy of the whims of an individual patient who may have been enslaved by his fantasy. Now, we are discussing the wider implications of Simon's Choice, the BBC documentary. Obviously, he went through a long period of consultation with the family, with his friends, and particularly with the physicians in this extreme case. Do you believe Simon should have the choice of his own?
I believe.
And do you believe this choice should be respected?
Under the circumstances, I think that request should be honored. That's why he moved from England to Switzerland, where this action can be taken. Then, of course, the documentary was made at the end of 2015, and the broadcast later on. So that choice should be honored. Let me mention something else. I think the reason that we don't have a decisive action taken or legislation passed to approve euthanasia is because this issue is very troublesome. It's not a clear cut, right and left, and black and white, because it involves religious beliefs. They are Christian people who are for this action. They believe that God gives the patient the will for his own future. So if he decided he's going to end his life, that's okay. But on the other hand, there are others who are also religiously oriented, are totally against it. That is to say, this issue is very difficult to make a clear-cut decision. So what we have to do, I think in China, we should bring this to the top table and to look it over, because several years ago, I understand, they were representative in the People's Congress in Shanghai had a proposal promoting this idea, but it was tabled. So I think China is facing this situation in the future. There are a lot of people getting old, a lot of people getting into this status, a lot of patients.
Yes, we have a large aging population.
Yeah, we have
in their millions. And according to the results of a recent survey about the use of euthanasia, up to 70% of the Chinese adopt a practical attitude towards this approach. What does that mean? A lot in the West would argue, hey, China is a secular country where you do have religions, but religious factors do not factor into this issue as strongly as in a Catholic country like European country or the United States. So maybe there's no point for us to argue here in the country where this is not a big issue. What do you think of, let's focus on the medical doctors. Some view the men and the women who assist the patients who want to die as a criminal. That may be a little bit too much. Maybe you quite agree.
I'm reluctant to call anybody a criminal. Technically, the people who are doing it in a country where it's legal, they're not violating the law. So it's hard to call them a criminal. Are they doing something that I have a moral obligation, or I morally disagree with? Yes, I don't agree with what they're doing, but I don't say I would call them criminal. Back to your point about the survey. You know, surveys are conducted all the time, and I believe this survey was done online. So it takes a certain amount of education and resources to be online. What about the hundreds of millions of people in China who live in the rural areas who never go online? Were their views represented in such a survey? I don't know, but I would be careful to give too much credibility to online surveys on a very, very nuanced subject like this.
We can raise numerous examples to illustrate the opposite views of David, because, for example, Madame Deng Yingchao, who was widowed by late Premier Zhou Enlai, said herself that she agreed to the use of euthanasia since she witnessed the last moments of agony of her husband, who had been confined to the bed for months, and he was not allowed to perform surgery for one reason or another. That caused a lot of debates for political reasons. So, you know, David said that families might feel that they had been abandoned in the case of Simon. But in this case, which occurred in China, the wife said she agreed to the use of euthanasia or assisted suicide. Maybe there is a big cultural difference. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.